Well, welcome once again to heartofashepherd.com for this Sunday, January the 7th, 2024 devotional. Our title today is Compassion and Justice, the Healing of Naaman the Leper, 2 Kings chapter 5. I do ask your patience with me as I continue to struggle with a cold. Well, the healing and the conversion of Naaman, the captain of the host of the king of Syria, is indeed one of the most beloved stories of the Old Testament scriptures. If you had the opportunity of growing up in church in a Sunday school class, no doubt this would have been one that you might have seen portrayed in a flannel graph by one of the dedicated teachers that you were able to sit under. And so let's begin by an introduction. First of all, we should ask the question, who was Naaman? Who was Naaman? 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, that is answered. Now, the opening verses of 2 Kings 5 then introduces a man who served as one of the trusted servants of the king of Syria. And Naaman was described in verse 1 as a great man with his master and honorable, his master being the king of Syria. He was, verse 2, described as a great warrior and was indeed a national hero of Syria. And yet, Naaman was afflicted by leprosy, a frightening, infectious disease that was the dread of men in ancient times. Well, providentially, in Naaman's household was a young Hebrew girl who served his wife as a household slave, in verse 2. And though numbered among some taken as the spoils of war, it appears that this Hebrew girl, her heart was tender towards her mistress and her master Naaman. Now, we're not told how, but the young servant heard there was a prophet in Samaria, that was the capital city of northern Israel. And she expressed to her mistress, and I quote verse 3, "Would God, my Lord, were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy." Well, in verse 4, receiving the words of the young girl and understanding her faith that the prophet of the Lord might heal him, Naaman went to the king of Syria, who said, Go, go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And we read in verse 5 that he departed and he took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. Well, with gifts at hand, Naaman traveled to Israel with an entourage, for he was, after all, the commander of the Syrian army. Well, when he came to the king of Israel, he presented him with a letter from the king of Syria, saying, Now, when this letter is coming to thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. Verse 6. Well, the king of Israel was overwhelmed with angst, and he feared the demand that Naaman be healed of leprosy was not only an impossible request, but was possibly a provocation for renewed conflict between Israel and Syria. Notice, though, beginning in verse 8 through 13, Elisha's intervention and demand. Now, news of Naaman's demand reached Elisha, and the prophet sent a messenger to the king of Israel, who asked, quote, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he, that is Naaman, shall know, in verse 8, that there is a prophet in Israel. Well, then Naaman and his servants journeyed to Elisha's home. And yet Naaman, the great warrior of Syria, felt slighted when the prophet failed to greet him. Instead, the prophet's servant delivered the message, verse 10, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. Well, Naaman was furious, not only by the slight he suffered, but by the demand that he should wash in Jordan 7 times. The proud warrior felt humiliated in verse 11, for he supposed Elisha should have received him and called on the Lord his God and strike his hand over the place where the leprosy was present and restore his skin in verse 11. Now, the thought of washing in the waters of the Jordan River was an offense to Naaman, and we read in verse 12 that he turned and he went away in a rage. However, as he departed, a brave servant approached Naaman and reasoned with him and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldst thou not have done it? How much rather then when he said to thee in verse 13, wash and be clean? Well, we find in verses 14 through 19 the record of Naaman's humility, his obedience, and his faith. Now the words of his servant quieted Naaman's anger, and he did as Elisha's servant bid him in verse 14. Coming out of the waters the seventh time, his flesh was miraculously made whole as the youthful skin of a child. And Naaman returned to Elisha, and he confessed, behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing, that is, take a gift of thy servant. In verse 15. Wow. What an extraordinary confession and statement of faith. Naaman believed the God of Israel was the one and true God. And in gratitude, he urged Elisha to accept the gold and the silver and the garments, and he brought his gifts. But the prophet, however, refused the gifts, for he would not be named among those prophets who enrich themselves by accepting gifts for that which God alone should be praised. In verse 16. Naaman then acknowledged the God whom Elisha served was, quote, God in all the earth. And yet he still made one request, that he might fulfill his duty to the king of Syria and accompany him when he went to the temple of Rimmon, I believe I'm saying that right, the Syrian equivalent of Baal, in verse 18. Well, in verse 19, Elisha did give his blessing, and we read that Naaman departed. Sadly and tragically, we come to verses 20 through 27, where we have the sin and covetous spirit of Gehazi, Elisha's servant, recorded. Now, tragically, the triumphant joy of Naaman's healing was soon overshadowed by Gehazi, a greedy, covetous man and the servant of Elisha. Now, while Elisha refused Naaman's gifts, Gehazi decided to enrich himself. And we read in verses 21 through 23 that he lied to the Syrian for his favor and gifts. Well, Gehazi took 2 bags of silver and garments from Naaman, and he hid the gifts in the house, according to verse 24. Now Elisha, wise and insightful concerning the character of his servant, questioned Gehazi, and he asked in verse 25, whence camest thou, Gehazi? And he said, thy servant went nowhere. Whither? That is, thy servant went nowhere. Well, hearing and discerning the servant's lies, Elisha rebuked Gehazi. He was then cursed with the affliction from which Naaman was cleansed. For we read in verse 27 that Gehazi went out from his presence, a leper as white as snow. Well, closing thoughts today. Naaman's deliverance from leprosy and his confession that the God of Israel was the one and only God reminds us that the mercies and compassion of the Lord are available to all who come to him in faith. Well, tragically, however, the story ends with a reminder that God punishes sin. You see, Gehazi had enriched himself with possessions Elisha refused. And then he lied to Naaman and Elisha, and God's judgment was swift and severe. Gehazi fled Elisha's presence, and he became a leper. You see, for the rest of his life, Gehazi's leprosy was a reminder to not only himself and his household that the Lord hates covetousness and lying lips. Well, what an interesting study we've had today. The profession of faith of a man that perhaps some would have thought would never be a believer, Naaman, the great warrior of Syria. And yet he professed his faith in God. And sadly and tragically, the fact that a servant of the prophet Elisha should lie and covet and ultimately himself suffer leprosy. The fate that was that of Naaman. Well, thank you for being a part of today's Heart of a Shepherd. God bless, and bye-bye.